In this lesson, we're going to make some final tweaks to our rocket swarm to improve the overall look. We'll set up our final render op to finish off the effect. So in the last lesson, we were talking about a couple issues that we had with this rocket swarm. Mainly, we had some areas of negative space up here that were a little distracting, and we're having a lot of volume buildup back here. So let's go ahead and fix that. I'm going to go into the rocket volume trails, and since we're making some look development changes here, I'm going to go ahead and turn that ISO 1 trail back on. So we have some more interactivity in the viewport. The first issue is our volume back here is flaring out too much, and that's probably due to that point jitter. If you remember, we put that custom attribute on there so we can molt that down if need be. So I'm going to change that to 0.4, and that's already fixed a lot of the issues we had. It's bringing that trail in much tighter. Now we're also getting that those areas of negative space up here, and that's probably because in our p-scale attribute, we were trying to use this power function to try to keep the trail thinner towards the front. But it looks like that's not giving us the effect we really want. It's causing more issues rather than fixing things. So I'm going to take that exponent out, and now you see that's filled in that space a lot nicer. Now the trail became a little bit too thick overall, so I'm just going to multiply this by 2, and now we've got closer to what our original thickness was. You can also change the point radius scale over in the cloud modeling tool if need be. Now we're still getting some areas of negative space, and that's probably due to that curl noise we have from this VOPSOP right here. If you remember, we put that mix in there if we ever needed to multiply that down. So I'm going to go in here and just change the bias down slightly so it's less noise, and that's fixing some of those areas of negative space, but we still have some contribution from the noise, so we're not taking it out entirely. Now the last thing I want to change is we're still getting a lot of density buildup back there. And one thing we can do is we can come over to our density. Right now we're just having the density fade off in a linear fashion, just off of color, the green color. Now if I put a power function on here, I can fade this density off exponentially, and that's going to get this density down much faster towards the back. So that's already looking a lot better. So to evaluate this properly, we probably need to be able to see multiple trails, but maybe not necessarily have to see all the trails because we're still doing some dev look right here. One thing you can do is over in the ISO trails, rather than just isolating one trail, I can use a modulus function. So if I do source ptnum modulus 10 equals 0, this is going to isolate every 10th trail. So you can see we've got one more trail in here. If I come down here to maybe frame 192, and just let that cook for a few seconds, you see we have about 5 trails here. So we can really visualize how these trails are contributing to each other, but we don't necessarily have to cook all 40 or 50 rocket trails at once while we're doing this development. So I'm going to go ahead and render this and see what it looks like. I'm going to pause the video. Okay, that render is done, and we can already see a lot of improvement here. Our trails are fading off much faster. We're not getting those areas of negative space up here. So this is looking pretty good. Now there's a few more changes we still want to make. First off, there's this annoying spec hit right here on this ground plane. That's because we never put a material on this plane. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. And then we're also going to want to make a few changes to our trail and our explosion materials to get these trails to look a little bit more impressive, get some more shading on there and make them look a lot nicer. But first, let's go ahead and let me make sure I pause the render so it doesn't update while I'm working here. And go ahead and just stick a material on this ground plane. So if you come over to the material palette under general, drag over a mantra surface, turn off base color so it uses that green that's on there, and under reflect, just turn off enable reflection layer. So I come back up here to the object network, come over to our ground plane, and just tell it to use that mantra surface. So next time we render, we won't have that spec hit right here. Now I want to make a couple changes to our materials. So I'm going to come to the shop network. And first thing I'm going to do is make some changes to our explosion material. So I'm going to come over to the fireball. So one thing I want to do is I want to make this explosion look really pyroplastic-y, make it really impressive and have a lot of density and maybe not so bright. So I'm going to come over here to the smoke tab and under density. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, it gives you this final amplitude of 0.3. I want to make this very, very dense. So I'm actually going to take this up to 20, and you'll see why in a minute. Now, one other thing I want to do is that with the default settings, the density is given this gamma value of 2.2, and I don't want the smoke to be that bright. I want it to be kind of dark and gritty, kind of like from a fuel combustion explosion. So I'm going to take that gamma down to 1. I'm going to come over to the shading tab, and at the same time I want our heat to emit some nice brightness onto our smoke. So I'm going to increase the emit brightness to 1.6, but I also want to have nice dark shadows. So I'm also going to increase our shadow density just slightly. So I'm going to pause the video and render this, and let's see what it looks like. Alright, that's done rendering, and as you can see, our explosions are much denser, and this is starting to look kind of cool. On a freeze frame, it's not really perceivable, but when we see the final animation, you'll see how these explosions look much more impressive because of the changes we just made. And we can also make similar changes to our billowy smoke. So I'm going to come over to our billowy smoke material, make sure this is turned off, and we can make some changes to our smoke density and shadow density as well. So for smoke density, I'm going to increase it just slightly, 1.5, and then for our shadow density, I'm going to increase that to 2. And this should improve some of the shading that is on our smoke trails. So again, I'm going to pause the video, and we'll see what this looks like. Alright, that render is done, and as you can see, we're getting a lot more shading on these trails up here, and that's looking really nice. So I think this look that we have here will probably work for our final render. So let's go ahead and start setting up that final render op. I'm going to go over to the Out Network. I'm going to drop down the new Mantra node. Make sure you change the camera to your main camera. And one thing I should have pointed out earlier is that when we put our camera down, we didn't really change. Let me make sure I turn the render off so nothing happens here. We didn't really change any parameters on here. Depending on whatever your scene or your movie is in, you might want to change this resolution from the default 640 by 480. We'll say we'll do 720 for our render. So I'm going to come back to the Out Network. So that's set right there, main camera. Since we're actually rendering to this time, we're going to do render frame range. So that will tell it to start from 1 and go all the way to the end at 240. Objects should be fine. Under properties, rather than doing IP, this time we're going to do a sequence of images. I'm just going to do TIFFs, but you could do JPEGs or bitmaps or whatever works best for you. Now, if you remember earlier when we were writing out our data, we were using that $data expression. We also made that pix alias, and that's where we're going to use that. So I'm going to do $pix, and that's going to write out to $OS and backticks version 1. And again, $OS and backticks version 1, $F4 TIFF. And we'll need to rename our Mantra node something else. We'll just call it Rocket Mantra Out. And if I go to the output picture, you can see it's writing out the pix out, Rocket Mantra Out version 1, Rocket Mantra Out version 1, and then the frame. So that looks correct. Now, because we're making that intermediate directory, make sure you come over here and do create intermediate directories or your render won't work. Now the last thing you might want to change is over on the sampling, there's 3 values here that's going to improve the quality of your render. You have the volume shadow quality, the volume quality, and the pixel sample. So you can increase this to something like 1 or 0.5, and that's going to give you a much nicer render. You're going to get a lot more shading on here because it's going to be, basically this is changing the size of the bucket that's looking at how many voxels to render here. So the higher the quality, the more voxels that get rendered on their own. And over here, the pixel samples will affect your anti-aliasing, so that'll fix some of these jaggy areas up here. But for now, I'm just going to leave these like this. You can change these values based on what kind of hardware you have available to you, or if you have a farm available to you. The more power you have, the more you can crank these up. But I'll leave these like this for right now. Now the last thing you'll want to do is, of course, make sure you turn all the trails back on so that you're actually rendering all the trails, not just the isolated trails. Now I've already gone ahead and rendered this out and put into a little movie file so we can see what this final effect looks like. So as you can see, we got our trails, we got our fire. You can see the little launch smoke right here, and whenever a rocket hits the ground, we get a nice explosion. Now there's still a few changes we can make here, like the explosions are popping off a little fast, and that could just be a couple parameter changes in the explosion sim we did several lessons ago. But overall, you're getting a pretty complex and pretty impressive effect without doing any custom simulations for all these rocket trails. So to be able to have that much control over where these rockets go and how many rockets you have and what's shooting them, really gives you a lot of flexibility depending on what kind of scenes you're working on. So that is how you can use Houdini to make a procedural rocket swarm. Hopefully these lessons have proved helpful and you're able to learn some new tricks and techniques along the way. Until next time, and thanks again for watching.